Welcome to my review of Marvel Land for the arcade. And I'm going to start with a warning. You see I'm playing the Japanese ROM, and that's what I did my complete playthrough on. If you are playing this on MAME, avoid the US ROM, because for me, I had to replay the entire game because near the end of the game just crashes and it's unplayable beyond a certain point. So therefore unbeatable. So I don't know if there's a better US ROM at this point, if it's been fixed, but if you want to be safe, just play the Japanese ROM. I was able to find online that was a version that I saw playthroughs of. I think the US one was probably bad for a while. Now, with all that said, I did notice differences between the US and Japanese ROMs, but the thing was, it was balanced in a different way. It wasn't as you would expect. Like, certain levels in the US version were much harder than the Japanese version, and certain versions in the Japanese version seemed harder than the US version. So it wasn't like a clear thing where I could say one version is necessarily much easier or harder than the other, as with a lot of these regional differences. So, there wasn't a clear line there for me. But with all that said, this is the Japanese ROM that I played through. And this game is strange. At first it seems kind of like a kid's game, very moderate, kind of easy difficulty, enjoyable. And then you get to like World 3 and it goes from being enjoyable to being like a slog of trial and error type of, as a lot of old arcade games. And you do have kind of more slippery control than you have in a lot of games, so it is more noticeable in this game. So to start with, you have your boss fights. There's a few different types of boss fights. The tug of war is the easiest one. If you have a rapid fire controller, just set that fucking shit to rapid and hold it down and you will win. Now, if you have to mash, I couldn't comment on that because, like I said, whenever I can use rapid fire, as I've said in many of my videos, I use it. Because all my controllers that I use pretty much have that ability. And if they don't, the emulators even have it built in a lot of times to where you can set buttons to rapid fire. Now, this is where the game really spikes in difficulty. You can see this is already getting ridiculous. You got to run in the opposite direction on a barrel to make it move the opposite way while you got all this other shit going on. And it's kind of a bitch, man. You can see it's one-hit deaths, obviously. And checkpoints are not frequent like they are in the Genesis version, which is a much easier version of this. So if you want to play an easier, more balanced, and fun version of the game, play the fucking Genesis or Mega Drive version. That's the best version to play, and the one I'd recommend, it has extra levels. It has more checkpoints. It's just a better made version of this game. So, but if you want kind of like an extreme version of this game, just play the arcade version, play the Japanese ROM. Now, the Genesis version I'm working on currently, the hardest mode, Game Master mode in the Genesis version, and that's still like way easier than the arcade version at default difficulty. So, like I said, if you really want a challenge, just play the arcade version on the default dip switch, normal, whatever it's set to, and you'll get it. Of course, the game isn't going to be really hard until you get to like the third world. That's where you see the spike, and the game starts to show its teeth from that point. And then you'll see what you're really in for as far as having to learn the levels and shit. And you'll see if this is the kind of game you even want to work on. You may decide that you're not having fun with it and you don't even want to work on it. But if you see my review, then you should know that I don't consider games difficult lightly. You know what I mean? I wouldn't just give it the high difficulty type of rating if it was some easy shit. So just be prepared for that. If you go in expecting that, you won't be surprised, at least. Now, it's definitely not the most brutal arcade game by any means. But it's just that once you get to stage 3, it just becomes like a real trial and error type of slog. And you just got to be willing to really learn each section. Of course, I use save states to practice everything and learn section by section on the later parts. Which I always recommend doing on these older games. Because as I said, I don't consider practice to be illegitimate in any way, no matter, how many times you practice a section with isolated practice. To me, it's completely legit. I mean, it's a tool we didn't have back in this time period, obviously, but to me, it's not illegitimate. I mean, just like, a musician would practice parts of a song to learn them. It's the same kind of thing to me. And then you put it all together, and that's how you get a mastery of a game, And so for me, that's all fucking legit. Now, I won't use save states to skip ahead or anything like that. I don't do that shit. But yeah, so for me, I mean, this game has unlimited continues. So, you do have unlimited continues. There's no tricks at the end where the game, says, fuck you, you're not getting any more continues. Some arcade games do that. They give you infinite continues. You get to the last section of the game, and then suddenly there's no more lives or continues. You lose one life, and you're sent to the beginning of the game. Because arcade games don't give a fuck. They're about trying to get your money and shit. So they don't care about doing some nasty tricks. But this game, at least it doesn't do anything like that. So you got your infinite continues, and you'll start at the beginning of whatever stage you got to. Now, if you lose your lives, whenever you lose a life, you'll be sent back to whatever the last stage checkpoint was. But then when you lose your remaining lives, you're sent to the beginning of the stage, when you waste a continue. So that's how that works. The game has some interesting momentum-based gameplay where you can kind of get on things and ride them, and as the things swing around, you can jump with that swing, and you can get these big jumps and shit based on momentum. Which it's really the only game of this time that I can think of that actually used real momentum kind of physics in that way. Of course, Super Mario Brothers is one of the early games to do that, where you really had momentum with your jump. You know what I mean? Back in the NES days. But this takes it to a little bit of a different level with actually riding things and getting momentum. Which I haven't seen really in any other games of this time that come to mind anyway. This is the only one I can think of. So I would say that's the selling point and the kind of unique gimmick of this game was that it had this momentum, this kind of physics. But with that comes some clunky shit too, where it doesn't always do what you would expect it to do, and you'll fall and slip on shit and fuck up sometimes if you don't know how it works. It's not super logical. Sometimes you think you got the momentum, but you just fucking fall flat. So it is something you have to get used to, and that's why you want to practice everything in sections. Now you have a few stages that are roller coaster style, which are really cool, where you have to kind of just duck and memorize what's coming. This was, I think, the longest and most difficult of these sections, but it's really not that hard. These are basically the easier stages in the game compared to what comes later. So, you'll have to memorize a few things in this stage because there's no checkpoints in these roller coaster stages, and that one's a little bit lengthy, but it's just a little bit of memorization, not too bad. So now on this stage, you get ice physics introduced a little bit, and that can be a pain in the ass because you slip around a lot. And the control's already kind of slippery, but you do get used to it. Now some enemies you can jump on and ride, while other enemies, when you jump on them, you'll damage them. Some might take 2 jumps to kill. And of course, you can get weapons in this game where you swing these clones of yourself at enemies. But the problem is, I almost never, when you watch my tutorial of the game, which I will link in the description, you'll see that most of the time I have no weapons, no power-ups, or anything like that. The other power-up is wings. You can fly, and you jump really high. But sometimes it can be a detriment, because it makes you jump really fucking high. But you can see how critical timing is in memorization with these parts. You can see I'm dodging a lot of shit, and it's because I know what to expect. But it is easy, as you can see, to fuck up. The control can be a little delayed. It almost feels like there's a bit of input lag to the controls. I don't know if that was just me, but I play through a lot of games, and I don't feel that on a lot of other games that I play. So I think there's a little bit of input lag. The way the game is just probably because of the extra animations in your character is what I'm guessing. If I had to guess. See, this is very specific. This is stuff that I would cover in the tutorial, so check that out. I'll explain exactly how I manage all these things. It's very specific. But you can see how trial and error this is. If you know these kind of games, you can see already. Remember, it's one-hit deaths. There's very few checkpoints. So you get the idea by watching it, you get a little bit of a taste of what you're going to have to expect. So I think this game, I would have to look it up. It's in my tutorial in my description, but I think it took over 6 hours to beat. And maybe closer to 7 if I remember right. And that was because some of these stages took a few hours to beat because they're so trial and error. Very tedious. And I mean, some of it is just kind of bullshitty if you ask me, because sometimes it feels like it's kind of fucking random with some of the hits that come out. And the control, like I said, is a little bit delayed. So I do have some gripes with the game as far as that goes. But the game has a nice atmosphere. It doesn't have a ton of different music tracks and shit as far as that goes, but I think it fits the game. And there's a decent amount of stages, It's a nice gameplay variety. Here I have the wings. I figured out that by setting one of my buttons to rapid fire, I could fly for much longer. Or it's more like a hover. You're not really flying, but you're gliding. But that's another trick. A lot of stuff that I covered in the tutorial. But yeah, by this point the game gets very, very hard. Now this is the final stage. I show this in the entirety. You can see how specific this shit is, right? I mean, you can see you're looking for these little gaps in timing and all this shit. It's a lot of trial and error. It wasn't, too bad for me just because I've done so many of these fucking type of games, and I've done some really extreme, old arcade games and other shit. But, I mean, even for me, I took several months off the game because I just wasn't in the fucking mood to learn the stages, step by step. I got to be in a certain type of mood to sit there and practice and learn. I'm not always in a fucking mood for that. So just be aware of that. And I'm used to these kind of games, and even I got agitated at times where I took a long fucking break. It was one of the games in my backlog. It kind of sat there for a while. So this is the final boss. Now you can see, there was one aspect I don't like about this game, and you saw it there a moment ago. It's this rock, paper, scissors game, and it involves, a lot of, it's kind of weird. It's hard to kind of read what's going to happen with the rock, paper, scissors game. I mean, it's learnable, and I got much better at it to where I could do it more consistently, but I just thought it was fucking irritating. I can't say it's all luck-based because you do have the ability to either block or strike, but you have to react super fast. You don't have a long window of time to react at all. It's like a split second. So you really got to be fast at reading the rock, paper, scissors game, and you got to know how the rules work for that, which I explain a bit of that in the tutorial and go over more details there, but I don't really like that aspect of the game. I'd rather have a traditional boss fight. So you do have to do some of those rock, paper, scissors boss fights, which, they're not really luck, but there's a little bit of luck there, I think, because, if your reactions aren't spot on, you can really get fucked over. Now, for this end sequence, this whole stage from the fireballs, the totem fireballs up to here, there's no checkpoints in this final stage. So you gotta beat the boss, you gotta do that fireball section, you gotta do this all in pretty much one life. You can't lose any lives in the final stage. So, I mean, that can be tough, but I had less trouble with this than I did on some of those other fucking stages, those trial and error bullshit stages. So, I mean, most of this is just running and jumping. Occasionally you'll get hit by a rogue spike that doesn't behave as you would expect, which sucks. That's kind of a random element of the game that I also don't like, that sometimes projectiles and spikes behave in a way that's very unpredictable. Unless maybe you memorize the exact movements like a machine or a computer would play a game or something. But for beating the game normally, you're not going to probably have it down to that extent. So yeah, for me, it's a pretty fun game overall. I mean, like I said, I expect the brutal challenge. It's more of like an extreme version of the Genesis game, even though it's the first version of the game. If you've played the Genesis version, this is the one you'd want to move up to next if you really want to like challenge yourself and get play an extreme version of the game. Then this would be that. I think that's the best description for the game, and I think it's a pretty solid game. I'd give it a 7 out of 10, but it's almost a little bit less for me because of some of the control issues and some of the weird momentum. But of course, you can learn all that, but it's not. It's not as like cut and dry as you would expect. It's not necessarily logical as you might expect it to operate. So it does take, you do have to kind of work around that by just learning the game and really learning the way it works. But overall, I think it's a pretty good game. I definitely recommend checking it out if you like these kind of old arcade games with, rigid trial and error difficulty. Then it's definitely a satisfying one to complete. If you have any questions, let me know, and thanks for watching.